All right, well, thank you for joining today's webinar on the influence of business models on PV battery dispatch decisions and market value. I'm Andrew Mills from the Berkeley Lab and one of the co-authors of this report. Today, I'm going to welcome our speakers and moderate the Q&A at the end of this. Before we get started, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. Attendees in today's webinar will be in listen-only mode. That means that if you have any questions, please go ahead and enter those via the Q&A box that's on your screen. And we'll set aside at least 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer those questions. If there's any that we don't get to, we'll try to follow up via email. Also, if you have any sort of logistical questions, you can enter those through the chat. I'll be monitoring that and trying to address those. And in addition, today's presentation will be recorded. We'll post the recording to our EMP website at the website that's shown in the chat, and I'll enter that in again here. The slides from the presentation are also available at the same link. In addition, you can find a link at the bottom of that page that goes to the 2020 update to the Solar to Grid report. So with that, I want to welcome our two speakers today. That's Dr. Seel and Cody Warner. Dr. Seel is a senior scientific engineering associate at the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at the Berkeley Lab. His research focuses on solar and wind market developments, the integration of high shares of intermittent and distributed renewable generation into the electricity grid, and associated effects on the electricity markets. He holds a PhD and MS in energy and resources and a master's in public policy from UC Berkeley. He also studied environmental policies and international relations at the International Jacobs University in Germany. Cody Warner is a graduate student researcher in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department. His research as a PhD student in the Energy and Resources group at UC Berkeley focuses on environmental and resource economics, electricity markets, and applied econometrics. He has a master's in energy and resources from UC Berkeley and a BA in economics and environmental policy from Northwestern University. So welcome again, everyone, and I'll turn it over to Yo.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and a warm welcome from me as well. My name is Seel, and I have the pleasure to present today two recently completed studies that investigate the market value of solar, both large-scale solar standalone projects, as they've been built around the US for over a decade, and solar battery hybrids, where solar is coupled with storage technology that have only been built recently. With me are two of my esteemed colleagues. Andrew Mills, whom you already heard at the beginning, has been the lead of the Solar to Grid study, and Cody Warner was instrumental in the solar battery hybrid study. Both projects that we present today were funded by the Solar Energy Technologies Office of the US Department of Energy, and we're very grateful for this public support of our work. In particular, we want to thank our project manager, Ruchi Singh, several external reviewers who helped us a lot, and in particular, the many solar battery project operators whom we interviewed and who contributed the foundational data for our second study. Of course, any omissions and errors remain our sole responsibilities. I will first provide some background to solar market valuation modeling at Berkeley Lab and summarize briefly findings pertaining to solar standalone projects. I will then explain why we decided that it was important to reach out to actual project owners and analyze the empirical dispatch of solar battery hybrid projects. Cody will then provide a little bit more background about our analytical methods, introduce you to our data sets, and explain what we've learned during our interviews with solar battery project operators. I will then present the market value premium that is unlocked by adding storage to solar projects and how this empirical premium compares to idealized value maximizing dispatch. And finally, we'll conclude by discussing the influence of several distinct business models on dispatch strategies and the associated effects on market value. We will then look forward to answering any questions that you may have. And in case that you've just joined us, please use the Q&A functionality throughout the webinar to submit any questions that you may have, and we'll get to them then later. So we just published an update to the Solar to Grid report, which assesses the bulk power system, which assesses how the bulk power system is impacted by solar growth, how solar contributes to grid reliability, and how solar's market value has changed over time. This report focuses on solar standalone projects without battery couplings. In order to do that, we first create hourly profiles for all solar, so that includes both large-scale PV and distributed PV, deployed throughout the 7 organized wholesale markets in the US and 10 additional utilities. We base these hourly generation profiles on system-specific technological characteristics and local irradiance records. And then afterwards, we devise them based on monthly system generation records and hourly ISO solar profiles. We then use ISO or market-specific rules to calculate the contribution of solar to resource adequacy, or what we will call the capacity credit of solar. And then we use wholesale power and capacity prices to calculate the energy and capacity value of solar. And finally, in the report, we analyze various indicators from the bulk power markets to identify impacts of solar to the larger grid. I will only be able to present a small subset of our findings here today in this webinar, but you can find a very detailed technical report, a briefing set, a recent webinar recording, a lot of the underlying data, and interactive data visualizations on our project website at emp.lbl.gov/renewable-grid-insights, and I invite you to visit that site. In the Solar to Grid report, we looked at the 7 main organized wholesale markets. Those are shown here in the top row, and major utilities with significant solar deployment. Those are shown at the bottom. On the left side, we show the capacity growth of solar by respective sector since the year 2012. And on the right side, we show the associated annual solar generation. As you can see, at the end of 2020, CAISO had by far the most solar deployed with nearly 25 gigawatts, which is roughly equivalent to 50% of its annual peak load. But other regions are adding solar at a rapid pace, for example, ERCOT or FPL in Florida. Utility scale solar, which we define here as projects larger than 1 megawatt, make up the majority of all deployed solar capacity, and in some regions like ERCOT, those large-scale systems represent a staggering 85% of all solar that has been built. Curtailment numbers are only reported in CAISO and in ERCOT, and while California curtailment has been growing over the past years to now a bit more than 3%, ERCOT's congestion-driven solar curtailment has stabilized over the past few years at roughly 6%. On this slide, we show variations in solar value for utility scale plants that were in our sample for the year 2020. The color of the bubble indicates the combined energy and capacity value, while the size of the bubble indicates the capacity size of a given project. The intensity of the blue background color shows solar penetration by region. You can see how values vary between regions. For example, CAISO and MISO have rather low solar values, while the value is really high in the middle of the country in SPP and in Florida in FPL. But value also varies within regions. Some project level value variation is based on generation profiles, which are influenced, for example, by local climates or certain technical characteristics, for example, whether a project uses single axis trackers. But they are also vary because of locational energy and capacity prices. Transmission constraints and associated price volatility and curtailment played, for example, a very big role in Western Texas in the Permian Basin in 2019, but less so in the year 2020. If you're interested in finding out more about the contribution of energy and capacity values for specific projects and how those have changed over the years, you can go to an interactive visualization on our project website and explore our estimates there in much more detail. And you can also download a lot of the underlying data there. Here you can see how energy value, that is shown in blue, and capacity value, that is shown in red, in the red bars on top, vary from year to year for solar. And that's primarily driven by broader trends, such as falling electricity prices over the last decade. Some fluctuations are driven by scarcity events. For example, the solar value boost in 2019 in ERCOT. But increasing penetrations also play a role in value erosion, for example, in CAISO. The good news is that the cost of solar that we represent here by levelized power purchase agreement prices have also declined dramatically, more or less maintaining solar's overall competitiveness. In 2020, the prices for newly signed PPAs have actually increased in several markets for the first time in quite a while. And whether this trend continues and whether it will pose a problem as solar value erosion may spread to more regions due to growing solar penetrations, I think remains to be seen over the coming years. One way in which solar developers respond to these value erosion trends that we just showed is by coupling solar with storage that can then shift solar generation from low-priced midday hours to higher-priced evening hours, for example. We have more than 150 gigawatts of solar hybrids in the interconnection queues by the end of 2020. And in some regions, like CAISO, nearly all of the newly proposed solar is now coupled with storage. Many studies that try to model system impacts of these new hybrid resources assume that that new storage is dispatched in response to real-time wholesale energy prices. But system owners actually have a lot of freedom in deciding what operational strategies may make the most sense for them. And they can target many different revenue sources, and profitable business models can be quite diverse, as we learned. So to address this uncertainty, we will now shift from the purely modeled solar standalone profiles of the Solar to Grid report to empirical generation records of real-world solar storage hybrid systems. Specifically, we want to see how the addition of batteries can affect the market value of solar. And Cody will take it away and discuss a little bit more the methods and data that we used for this exercise.
Thank you, Yo, and thank you, Andrew, and welcome for me as well. I will now dive into our second study that we released last week, looking at how business models impact operational decisions of PV battery hybrids and how those in turn affect the value that these hybrid projects offer to overall grid needs. I'll start discussing our methods and the data that we used for this analysis. So we use empirical PV battery hybrid dispatch data to compare the market value of PV battery hybrids to standalone PV profiles. Our marginal market value is made up of three elements. We calculate the average annual energy value by simply multiplying delivered energy with the coincident hourly real-time energy price from the nearest wholesale price node. To derive capacity value, we first calculate the capacity credit of each project. This captures the contribution to resource adequacy requirements according to prevailing market rules. We then multiply this firm capacity with the coincident capacity prices, which vary by ISO zone, as well as month, season, or year. And to facilitate comparisons with energy value, we denominate capacity value in dollars per megawatt hour of solar generation. Finally, we include ancillary service value for a subset of projects that provide regulation services. Because we don't have sufficient data to calculate ancillary service mileage payments, we focus only on AS capacity payments that capture roughly 90% of the overall ancillary services value. So based on this definition, the market value is equivalent to the total revenue that would be earned by selling output at the prevailing wholesale market price. In all cases, we report market value per unit of energy generated by the standalone solar system. What we don't consider, we don't include any other types of grid system related value that solar hybrids might provide, such as offsetting new transmission assets, resilience, energy security, other wholesale price effects, or any other environmental or social costs that are not already internalized in wholesale energy and capacity markets. So the value to the wholesale market is meant to be a proxy just for the impact on the overall bulk power system. We collect plant level information with hourly resolution, including the generation profile of the PV asset, charging and discharging activity of the battery asset, and the combined generation profile of the PV battery hybrid. We use the PV generation profile, which we call PV standalone, to quantify the energy and capacity market value of the project if it were not coupled with the battery. And then we contrast those results with the market value of the combined PV and storage profile, which now also includes ancillary services value. So the difference of the PV hybrid value and the PV standalone value is what we are going to call the storage premium. The storage premiums from the empirical dispatch vary across projects and their specific storage configurations, business models, locations. So to assess the alignment of PV battery hybrid dispatch with wholesale energy market signals, we develop what we call the PV plus storage baseline, with which we can compare each project. And so this hypothetical baseline uses the project-specific empirical PV generation profile, but then it dispatches the battery to maximize profit based on the local wholesale energy revenue. This baseline dispatch ignores any potential signals from the capacity and ancillary services market. And like previous studies, we assume perfect foresight of PV generation and wholesale energy prices, and we require the batteries to be charged exclusively from the PV generation. I've listed a few of our other assumptions there on the right, but I will not dive into those in the interest of time. So in terms of data, we identified 46 PV battery hybrid projects that were online for the entirety of 2020 based on records by the Energy Information Administration. We reached out to all owners of these types of plants in the 7 organized wholesale markets and conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 operators. And after some convincing, we were able to get access to dispatch data for 11 plants for all hours of the year 2020. To protect their identity, we will only use anonymized identifiers. Overall, we have 1 project in CAISO, 3 plants in ERCOT, and 7 in ISO New England. Overall, the average characteristics of our 11 hybrids are similar to the larger sample of 46 plants, although our sample projects have a slightly smaller battery to PV capacity ratio on average, and slightly longer battery duration. For each of the plants in our sample, we had in-depth interviews with the plant owners. First, just to verify the data and understand the factors that affect how these operators dispatch their hybrid plants. So when we interviewed the operators of these hybrids, it became clear that several of them targeted similar revenue streams. And so we grouped them based on their overarching operational strategies, and we really identified 4 distinct business models to which we could map our 11 projects. And so this taxonomy of PV battery hybrid business models is really an important qualitative result of our study, and it builds the foundation for understanding why empirical market value can be less than what it would be if it was optimized for wholesale market needs, as we model them with our hypothetical baseline dispatch. The most straightforward business model employed by PV battery hybrid operators is what we call the merchant plant business model. Under this strategy, the plant operator maximizes profit by responding directly to competitively set price signals in organized electricity markets. Only 3 of our 11 plants in our sample fit this merchant plant model, and all 3 of these plants were located within ERCOT. Among all 4 business models, the dispatch of the PV battery merchant plant most closely follows competitively set wholesale electricity market prices. And these prices are the best real-time reflections of electric power system conditions. So we expect the PV battery merchant plant to dispatch when the system needs it the most. The next business model, the peak load reducer model, generates value by reducing the load of a load serving entity during peak times. So for example, utilities in ISO New England typically pay for transmission services via a tariff that is based on their load during regional monthly peak load events. And likewise, they pay for capacity based on the forward capacity market price and their annual peak load needs. So the peak load reducer business model aims to forecast when these peak hours will occur each month, when the demand charges will be assessed, and then dispatch its PV battery hybrid to reduce its reliance on the transmission network during those hours. In addition, any energy from the hybrid can also lower the energy charges for the load serving entity, settled at the prevailing wholesale energy price. And then also, while it's not being utilized to lower peak load, 4 of these plants in our sample also provide frequency regulation services. The next one, as you know, the deployment of PV battery hybrids is still growing, and several federal and state incentive programs exist to really encourage investment. So some operators really primarily focus on obtaining revenues from incentive programs, and therefore have to comply with certain rules related to these incentive programs. So one of the 11 hybrids in our sample relies entirely on a state incentive program for its revenue. It's part of the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target Program, SMART, which pays a feed-in tariff for energy dispatched during certain seasonal windows. It also contributes to the Massachusetts Clean Peak Energy Standard that rewards generation during seasonal peak periods and during monthly peak hours. And then the 4th business model here is what we call the large energy consumer. With this one, the dispatch of the PV battery hybrid is determined primarily by private end user characteristics and not bulk power system needs. So types of these hybrids include ones located at military bases, jails, manufacturing facilities, water treatment plants, oil and gas operations. And so one of the 11 plants in our sample located in CAISO fits this business model. And so the large energy consumer typically places a premium on the ability to ride out multi-day outages and shorter outages lasting several hours. And so to meet these criteria, the battery must be kept at a full state of charge during most hours and cycled infrequently, only in the event of an outage. So this operating strategy doesn't, really benefit the electric grid directly, but it can provide significant benefits to the end user and possibly the local community in the event of a natural disaster or other form of outage. Our large energy consumer faces a non-coincident peak demand charge, and so the hybrid discharges to reduce its monthly maximum demand, regardless of whether that lines up with the system demand. Here we describe the empirical metering data obtained for the 11 projects operating for the year 2020. So 7 of the 11 hybrids you can see on the left claim the federal investment tax credit and charge at least 75% of the battery's energy from the on-site PV generator, thereby meeting or exceeding the ITC threshold. The other projects were either built before the ITC was available or are owned by operators that don't have federal tax liabilities, so they couldn't monetize the ITC. These plants often focus on providing regulation reserves, and we see that high regulation reserve prices often occur outside of PV generation hours. And the PV battery hybrids differ not just in how much they use solar for charging the batteries, but also in the timing of when these batteries are discharged, depicted there on the right graph. So again, this can be explained by their business models and the timing of grid needs. For example, all 7 of the New England plants are either peak load producers or incentive participants. So they're going to target peak loads or incentive program rules that occur in the evening hours. So all but one of these New England plants discharge at least 80% of the battery during these hours, and the one that does not discharge in the evening uses the battery to provide regulation reserves. Now we also find variation in how often each plant is cycled, indicated by those dots on the chart. You see some plants cycle about 3 times per week on average, and others cycle roughly once per week. And so more frequent cycling generates more market value and more revenue to the owner, but it comes at the expense of higher maintenance costs and an abbreviated asset lifetime. All right, I'll pass it back over to Yo.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Cody. And just as a reminder, please submit any questions that you may already have via the Q&A function here in Zoom. We're trying to answer some of them on the fly, but we'll get to the others at the end of the presentation. So let's turn now to the market value for the year 2020 of the standalone PV profiles, the empirical PV battery hybrid dispatch, and the hypothetical baseline dispatch that is optimized for a wholesale energy market revenue. We'll first analyze the project's contributions to meeting resource adequacy requirements, and then detail the energy, capacity, and ancillary service value. And finally, we'll compare the empirical storage value premium to the baseline premium. Let's first look at how the contribution to resource adequacy requirements changes for PV projects once they add a battery. We find that market rules really matter a lot here. For example, ISO New England offers multiple assessment options of the capacity contribution of this hybrid project, and we will examine 2 of them here. One can look, for example, simply at the median output of the PV battery hybrid system during certain peak windows, which is what we here call the profile-based capacity credit. Because performance is assessed then over all days within a given season, the battery dispatch that occurs only a few times a week cannot raise this credit by a whole lot. And you can see that the solid orange bars from the empirical hybrid dispatch on the graph on the right is just barely above the golden bars for the solar standalone capacity credit. An alternative method in ISO New England evaluates the battery and the PV capacity credit separately. And here we simply look at the potential maximum sustained battery discharge over a 2-hour period, and then add that battery credit afterwards to the PV credit. We call this the design-based credit, and picture it with the hatched bars in the graph on the right. This method...
I think we need to go one more slide forward.
I was still talking about the capacity credits. So
we're just seeing the PV battery market value header slide.
Oh, that's funny. Is it going forward now?
Not yet. I think folks on chat are having the same issue.
Okay. Let me stop sharing. Can you give me some feedback what you currently see?
I'm still seeing nothing's changed on our end. I could try pulling it up as well.
Yeah, give me 1 second. It seems that my Zoom froze up. Unfortunately, I cannot. I cannot even stop sharing on my slide right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think either we can ask folks to pull up the slides, or you could try leaving and coming right back in.
Yeah, my only concern is that I would then shut off the webinar for everybody. Can you or Andrew try to take over screen share?
Yep, let me pull up the slides.
And mine says I can't while you're sharing still.
This is very unfortunate. Okay, so I will on the fly. I will try to get out of the meeting and go back in. If you get booted from the presentation, please go back to your calendar invite and click the join link again.
Could you try sharing host with one of us before you leave, maybe?
I cannot access any of the Zoom controls right now. It's just, yeah, so.
Sounds good, Yo. And
Okay.
while Yo's doing that, why don't we just jump into one of the questions in the meantime that kind of goes back. So I'll ask this of Cody.
Yep.
So this was just one question related to the peak load reducer model. And the question was whether or not that simply shifts the capacity cost to other load serving entities, and how can this actually be an economic benefit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think it shifts the capacity cost to other load serving entities. I mean, in the long run, you know, if you're lowering, you know, the peak load, you know, certainly, you know, then you would not need as much capacity. You know, you wouldn't need to procure as much capacity if you're able to use these batteries to, you know, minimize the use of the transmission network and, you know, minimize the need for you know, excess generators during those peak hours. So I think, you know, this would be an economic benefit.
Let me ask one more while Yo's getting set up, but it looks like he's there. It's related to the business models also. So you described 4 different types of business models, and to what extent do you think a battery could combine these different business models? The questioner asked, said that they've heard of companies like Fluence creating artificial intelligence and machine learning automated bidding systems. Do you think that software like that can be effective at sort of doing this multiple input output optimization?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and that's something we did when speaking with developers, and we talked about these business models. You know, 1 or 2 mentioned that they have heard of projects coming online that, you know, that kind of combine some of these business models, and we certainly did our best to try and make sure these business models were somewhat unique and mutually exclusive. But I think with batteries, you know, they're sophisticated pieces of technology, and they allow you to do so many different things that I think, you know, it certainly is the case that you can combine some of these elements. So that's a good question.
Guys, can you see the capacity credits right now?
Yeah, looks good, Yo.
Great. Okay, so we were talking before this technical mishap about distinguishing various ways that ISOs think about capacity credit. In ISO New England, we had this profile-based capacity credit that just looks at the aggregate output of the PV hybrid system. And then also this design-based credit that looks primarily at the maximum sustained battery discharge over a 2-hour PV period and a 2-hour period, and especially this design-based capacity accreditation method really leads to a big boost in the capacity credit, and then that later on has knock-on effects on the associated capacity value. In CAISO, the story is similar, except that one is not looking there for the separate battery credit at solely a 2-hour performance period, but a 4-hour performance period. And that then yields a separate battery capacity credit, which is added on top of solar aggregate capacity credit that is based on the effective load carrying capability method that CAISO deploys. So as a result of this, the capacity credit for our California project then jumps from the mid 20% to nearly 80% in the summer and up to 60% in the winter. And the story is similar for ISO New England, where especially winter performance of projects increases a lot. So what does this mean for the actual market value of our hybrids? We find that the market value is based on their empirical dispatch, and that always exceeds the market value of the standalone PV project. So adding storage always leads to a boost in market value. And the majority of this increase is driven by the capacity value that we just briefly touched upon, except in ERCOT, where there is no separate capacity value that is being rewarded. And in some instances, that premium associated with the storage deployment is also driven by ancillary service value. In contrast, the energy values are usually very similar between both configurations. For a few projects, the battery dispatches the overall hybrid generations into higher priced hours. And so that would lead to an increase in energy value, but that premium is always smaller than just $2 a megawatt hour. And when I first looked at the data here, I was really surprised by that. For some projects, the average energy value even decreases by a small amount relative to the standalone PV profiles because of some of the efficiency losses that occur once you pump the electricity through the battery unit. The higher capacity credits that we just discussed result in a sizable increase in the capacity value. And the capacity value is higher for projects with larger batteries relative to the PV capacity, and those that have multi-hour duration of storage. The CAISO PV battery hybrid can double its capacity value to $13 a megawatt hour. And in ISO New England, the profile-based capacity credit leads to only a moderate capacity value gain for the hybrid projects, but then this design-based capacity credit can really increase the capacity value by a factor of 2 to more than 7. So ranging from $17 to $54 a megawatt hour. As I said, no capacity values are shown for ERCOT because the market there relies only on the energy market and does not impose resource adequacy obligation on load serving entities with associated payments. 6 projects in our sample also participate in ancillary service markets and then earn additional revenue that range from $1 to $14 a megawatt hour, depending on a variety of factors. So comparing the storage value premium across our sample is complicated by the fact that the premium varies in part because of the different technical characteristics of the plant, like how big the battery actually is, and the different wholesale market environments in which these projects operate. So to better isolate the variation in storage value premium that is just driven by differences in operational strategies, we compare the empirical storage value premium of each PV battery hybrid with that of this common hypothetical baseline. The baseline is the storage value premium that could hypothetically be achieved with the same technical capabilities in the same location, but with a dispatch based on maximizing the energy market revenue with perfect foresight. Empirical premiums that are the same as this hypothetical baseline then fall on the diagonal line of equal performance, and projects that earn revenue from ancillary services can outperform this hypothetical baseline, and they would be above the diagonal in the top left. while operational strategies that provide less market value than what they hypothetically could will be below this diagonal at the bottom right. And there are a number of reasons that can explain this underperformance. For example, real-world operators lack the perfect foresight of the baseline model. So that's the case for our ECOT3 project, as you can see, that's down here, just a little bit below the diagonal. Or they may confront teething issues in the first year of commercial operation. We found this was the case with ECOT2, where the empirical premium, was like $8 a megawatt hour, but our baseline was able to actually dispatch and get up to $18 a megawatt hour of storage premium. And it did so by jointly dispatching the battery unit at times of really high high prices, which also coincided with times when solar itself was already generating, and so just put the battery output on top of the solar output at that time. And in practice, the operator just didn't seem to do that as much as our baseline model suggested they should. But finally, the operators may simply follow other dispatch signals due to their business model that have nothing to do with the wholesale market. And that was the case for our large energy consumer in CAISO, and can explain why the hypothetical premium could be much larger than what is achieved in reality. So operators of at least 8 of the PV battery hybrid plants in our samples employ business models whose objective is not to maximize wholesale market value alone, but instead their private profit maximizing dispatch signals are often much stronger than the price signals that are conveyed by wholesale energy markets. And absent any larger reforms to tariffs or incentive program structures, these deviations will likely persist and will continue to drive a wedge between the potential market value of the PV battery hybrids and what they contribute in practice. So we can showcase the influence of business models by looking at 2 similarly configured and located PV battery hybrid plants in ISO New England. Given that both plants are in moderate proximity to each other and share similarly sized components, one would expect that both would be dispatched in the same way and provide a comparable market value. But we do not find this to be the case in practice. In this graph, we show on the top how the battery dispatch would look like if it was optimized for a wholesale market value, and what the projects do in reality, and that's what we show at the bottom. ISO New England 7 is an incentive program participant, and we show its dispatch during a few days in the summer on the left side of this graph. It operates the battery to comply with the relevant program rules rather than optimizing for energy arbitrage. And complying with this Massachusetts Smart Incentive Program requires cycling the battery asset at least 52 times per year during the summer and winter peak periods. And this incentive payment is much higher than the price signal sent by real-time energy prices, but it is much coarser, and it does not allow for dynamic responses to ongoing grid needs. This ISO New England 7 project also participates in the Clean Peak Energy Standard that rewards generation during ISO New England's 12 monthly system-wide peak demand hours. But when those hours occur is only known in hindsight. And as shown in the lower left, ISO New England 7 lacks this perfect foresight and misses the peak hour for the month of July and dispatches instead only during the regular daily smart peak periods. ISO New England 5 is a peak load reducer and is shown here on the right side of the graph. It only aims to minimize its peak load during the 12 hours when its use of the transmission network are determined, and during the single annual hour when its portion of system-wide capacity costs are set. So ISO New England 5 can avoid a combined cost that is greater than $100,000 a megawatt hour during the annual peak hour. And that, of course, is far greater than any wholesale energy price could ever be. And indeed, ISO New England 5 tries to hit that system-wide peak on the day it occurred. And because it didn't quite know whether that would be the monthly peak, it also tries to dispatch a few days afterwards to see whether the peak load would rise above the previous day. Comparing this with a real-time energy price at ISO New England 5's nearest node and the optimized dispatch that is shown on the top just illustrates how strong the peak load reducer business model signal is really compared to the simple merchant model. The peak load reducer business model also discourages frequent cycling of battery storage, leaving it idle for much of the time, and limiting the cycling of the battery only to the top peak hours of the year may provide the grid with important capacity value during those hours, but it really misses an opportunity to alleviate the daily stresses between peak and off-peak hours. So why are some operators not hunting down additional merchant revenue? We conclude here with a comparison of the estimated revenue for both ISO New England 5 and ISO New England 7 if each had adopted the merchant model instead, and that's shown on the left. The graph underscores that the business models can yield very different storage premiums, both for the empirical profiles that are shown as bars and the hypothetical profiles that are optimized for each business model, which is shown as diamonds. For ISO New England 5, dispatching the battery storage to avoid costly transmission and capacity demand charges produces a storage premium of approximately $85 a megawatt hour, which could even rise by another $20 a megawatt hour if the operator had perfect foresight of peak load hours. This premium dwarfs the storage premium that it could earn via energy arbitrage and generation capacity payments that the merchant model targets. ISO New England 7 instead pursued the incentive program participant business model and realized a storage premium of about $35 a megawatt hour, which is largely determined by the storage adder of the smart incentive program. This realized storage premium slightly exceeds the storage premium of the merchant model, but the incentive program just provides a much greater total revenue, again, close to $150 a megawatt hour of annual solar generation. So to conclude this presentation, the PV battery hybrid projects dominate interconnection queues in some regions in the United States, but so far really very few projects have been operational long enough to assess how this hybrid capabilities may be used in practice. And with empirical dispatch data that we collected, we could demonstrate that the market value varies not just by location and technical design characteristics of PV and the battery, but also by the project operator's business model. And in fact, only a minority of the projects that were in our sample optimize the battery dispatch for wholesale market revenue as merchant plans. The majority follow other business models as they can earn much higher private revenue there. Regulators who design tariffs and policymakers planning incentive programs should ensure that the implicit signals that they send to their participants are aligned with the actual dynamic grid needs. So, of course, our study is only a snapshot of 11 PV battery hybrids in the single year 2020. And our sample may not capture the operational strategies and dispatch of all the hybrids that are out there. And we know, of course, that the storage premiums are not set in stone. They will evolve with a greater storage deployment over the coming years. The market will become more mature and operators become more sophisticated. And of course, wholesale price dynamics will continue to change. But considerations of this operated dispatch decision, I think, will only become more important as this market segment grows. And hybridizing PV with batteries has the potential to make the solar production really much less weather dependent and much more responsive to overall grid system conditions. But to fully realize on this promise, I think policymakers will want to ensure that the incentive structures that they set up are actually properly aligned with grid needs. And so with that, I will conclude the core part of the presentation, we have our emails and phone numbers listed here on the slide. Feel free to reach out to us if you want to discuss certain aspects of the study a little bit more in detail or have additional thoughts. You can also download a longer preprint of a technical report of this business model work and this briefing deck that we presented today at our project website. And you can also go to this other project website of the Solar to Grid report to download associated material there. We're publishing a lot in this space. Just recently, some other work came out that looked specifically at ancillary service values for hybrids and optimal system design and a bunch of other considerations. So in order to be informed about that kind of research, I would invite you to sign up to our mailing list, and then you'll get an email whenever we publish something new. So with that, I think we still have a couple of minutes left to address some questions that may have been posed.
Great, thanks. And there has been a lot of good Q&A going on, and some of the questions have been answered by typing already. So we'll move through these kind of quick. I'm going to actually go ahead and take the first one. So just stepping back, there was a question about the general approach, even in the solar to grid, about evaluating the contribution of solar to system reliability. And the question was, how do you account for the fact that solar production is not statistically independent of load or of other solar plants? And the concern was that some of the methodologies described here for valuing capacity value of solar PV might be flawed. So the general approach in this series of studies has always been to take the approaches that are being used for valuing capacity that are in practice at the ISOs. And so in almost all of them, you can see that they take account any sort of correlation with load by looking at production during sort of peak load periods or something along those lines. So there is sort of inherent in a lot of these methodologies something that has to do with correlation with load. But the majority of them are doing this in a way that just looks at the production during those peak load periods and doesn't necessarily account for the fact that because of correlation of multiple solar plants and things like that, that you might end up with a shifting of the net peak load period to another time. So the one that does do that is the California ISO, where they're using an effective load carrying capability that tries to both account for the statistical sort of correlation with load and with other solar plants in their methodology. But I would agree that the other methodologies are not necessarily accounting for this correlation with other solar plants. And again, so our approach is simply to take what the ISOs are currently doing in practice and utilize that. And we're not necessarily going into evaluating whether or not those methodologies are accurate or not. That's sort of another series of research. I think is an important question. So let me go to another one that's general, and I'll ask this of Yo. It was asking, in most states, solar is being installed due to mandatory portfolio standards rather than due to its particular market value. And the question is, does this invalidate the concept of value erosion?
Yeah, I don't think that doesn't validate the concept. So I think taking a step back, yes, mandatory portfolio standards were really important in, I'd say, like the mid 2010s in driving additional solar growth. Since then, a couple of states have pushed their renewable portfolio standards even further to 100% clean energy standards. And of course, that will drive additional solar and wind deployment. But in many other regions, like the Southeast, Florida, Georgia, etc., solar is now really built because of its economic contributions as well. And it's just much more cost competitive than even just running existing natural gas projects. And so the apparent market value really is a strong driver of additional solar growth there. What this market value metric captures is the amount of money that either a solar project operator would earn if they would sell all of their electricity at the wholesale market, or what a power purchaser would have to pay at the same to get the same electricity at the same node during the same hours. And so if the market value declines rapidly due to a lot of solar growth that may not be mitigated by transmission expansion or hybridization or other factors, more flexible load, for example, then the willingness to pay for this electricity may go down a lot. And so that should inform power purchase agreement prices that are being signed. And there's a lot of demand by corporates for renewable electricity, and so that should potentially inform also their willingness to pay for those PPAs. So I think there is, even if the link is not always direct, there should be at least an indirect link to this market value, and I think it's less important to at least keep an eye on.
Okay, and then I'll ask this next one for Cody. There's a question about, for the merchant plant analysis, did we look at anything like the day-ahead and real-time spread risk? It only shows that we're looking at real-time prices, but they would think that the site might offer a forecast in the day-ahead market too.
We did not. That's a good question, and I do know, there are some studies out there that model the value of hybrids, and they do look at this question of not assuming perfect foresight and kind of dispatching according to the day-ahead market. But we did not look at that. So our with the empirical data, they are dispatching, and they're assuming that risk of the day-ahead market in the empirical data. But with our model baseline, we assume perfect foresight. So that model baseline is kind of a best case scenario for the value. But yeah, that's a good area for future research too.
And then for Yo, the question is kind of going back about the economic value of frequency regulation and understanding if we studied that and how that relates to some of these other streams.
Yeah, so over here you can see this ancillary service adder that we looked at. In general, the ancillary services that were provided by the project in our sample were primarily regulation services. There are a couple of ISOs that have separate regulation up and down signals and products, such as ERCOT, for example, and others such as ISO New England, where that is one combined signal. And these projects only provided regulation services and not spin or non-spin services. So that is the only ancillary service value that we quantified here. And you can see it varies a little bit. ISO New England 1 did not qualify for the solar ITC and was thus able to charge the battery from the grid, which enabled it to play a little bit more in the regulation up and down market at the same time. Whereas the other three projects here had to primarily charge the battery from the solar unit, and with us more limited in the amount of ancillary services that they could bid into the market. And that kind of explains why this ancillary service value revenue here is so much higher than for the other three. So with this research, we only looked at regulation products. There's another recently completed study that our colleague Fritz Karl published that you can find on our EMP website, that really dives deeply into the various ancillary service markets and how renewable hybrids could potentially play there, and what the value premium is that they may unlock. So that's a little bit more hypothetical, zooming out, looking at all markets. And this is just looking here at the empirical values that we found with our 11 projects.
And then just one final question. There's two more left, but we're not going to be able to get to both. But just have you considered any future declines in costs of storage and solar PV?
We have not, and that is an important thing to note here, right? Like, we only look at the year-to-year variation in solar market value. Of course, a PV project that is built now is going to be online for maybe 30 years. We are not making any claims here what the market value may be in year 10, year 20, year 30. That will all inform kind of the revenue potential for the current solar projects, and how that future value erosion may compare to future cost declines of solar and storage assets. So no, we're not looking at that at all here.
Okay, thanks so much, you guys, for this webinar, and we appreciate all of the great comments and discussions from the audience. And we look forward to future webinars with you all. And thanks again, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.